tonight's Downshifting Revolution with my friend James Allen. I discovered James sometime in the middle of last year, late at night in my bed when I couldn't sleep. And I went to my phone for some help, and I searched for articles around climate change and despair. And I found this incredible article called Pontoon Archipelago. And I read it, and it gave me so much succour, so much support, because it was written with such love and depth and delicacy and compassion. And I went, who is this person? I presumed it was some professor in America. It was my first thought. Then I found he just lives on the other side of our mountains. And so we just got chatting over the internet. And yeah, we've met twice, I think, in the flesh. And now it's... So yes, when I thought about guests to invite to this series of conversations on Downshifting Revolution, how to live well in these times and adapt to the circumstances that we live in, I was very pleased to invite James along to be a guest for that work, for that conversation. And so, for someone who had a terrible cough, I do natter on, don't I? I wanted to, there's so much I'd like to sort of explore in this conversation, but I think it would be really lovely to hear a bit from James about this, the creation of this really beautiful piece of work, this article, Pontoon Archipelago, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Collapse, which is a reference to the famous Peter Sellers movie. Yeah. How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about your process and how you your journey to that work, if you would be so good as to share that with us.
Thanks, Maya. And thanks for inviting me. I was really sort of honoured that anyone actually spent the 25 minutes or the half hour it takes to read the essay, and then to reach out and sort of extend this invitation. I was really quite honoured, and that you guys all turned up, so, which is pretty neat. And also, just while I'm on the thanks, the acknowledgement to country was really beautiful, and I think it's all too often token, and it was definitely not token. It brought me right into this place, so I really appreciate that. The essay, I just had a moment of inspiration one night and wrote it down in an hour and a half, and then hit the publish button, which is definitely not how it happened. So it was probably about 18 months in the works, partly because I was occupied with family, but also because it was never intended as a public piece. It was just it was an attempt on my behalf to try to render coherent my thoughts, so that I could act in the world with something resembling integrity and consistency and congruence, and so I think that's probably an obsession of mine, to ensure that I'm congruent, and that I'm at least consistent in my action and my thinking. And so I was piecing it together over the course of sort of 18 months, and I guess it began because I've spent a lot of time over the course of my career, particularly the last 12 years, thinking about risk, existential risk, and various roles through government, all dabbling in this space, and so I was pretty attuned to increasingly attuned to what I saw as some pretty significant existential risks that we were facing as a community and as a global community. And it didn't really, I wasn't really compelled to write until such time as I had children, because I think, as I say up front in the piece, that there's nothing like having children to really sharpen your focus on the future, what comes after you. And so that was really the driver for me to kind of go, how is it that I act in a way that is actually in service of them? And so I pieced it together, and I guess like a lot of people who are attuned to the nature of the crises that we're facing, be it climate change, or be it sort of economic crises, or ecological crises more broadly. I call out sort of a crisis in sense making there I think we're also facing. It can be pretty overwhelming, and I think one of the things that I was finding is, despite having a career in that space and required to routinely write and give advice on these kinds of topics, the sense of to people who ostensibly have some power to do something about it, there was still not much of a sense of agency there. So here I was offering that up and not really seeing the impact. And so I was grappling with that and trying to understand, like, where is the agency that I have to be able to act in the world, to be able to contend with these kinds of things, when the future of my children is, at least they deserve to know that I've sort of attempted to do something. So I was grappling with the magnitude of the issues compared with the tiny size of my agency, and then trying to understand how I could move into that or through that. And so obviously when you're faced with that differential, it can be quite despairing. And so there was a period there where I was sort of in that space, and but knew it was useful and necessary. And so I guess I sort of tried to hold that space a bit for that despair, because I knew it was there was insights to be gleaned, but to also look for ways beyond that. And the way in which I did that, I suppose, was I reconciled that I actually don't have much agency at that magnitude. But where I do have agency is actually in the domain that, as it turns out, ends up like mattering the most to me anyway, and for most people, and that is really local. It's in community, it's in my family, it's in my neighbours, it's in the areas that I would term of your life that are at the human scale, that you can comprehend, process and act with some congruence. And so I guess the essay sort of cascaded out of that, and I came up with a few ideas I think it's still, every now and again I'll go in and I'll sort of change a few words here or there, because I think it's a piece that actually has to evolve with time. But I did come up with a few sort of ideas as to how I could begin to act on that. So yeah, I guess that's how it came about, and then hit the publish button, and ended up in your bedroom somehow.
On the end of a phone, yeah, that's right. Well, that's it. That's the strange intimacy of writing. I mean, I write a bit too, and you understand that sense that you can, the writing process itself is quite an intimate thing. You're talking to your own soul in a way. when you do that, and then you send it out, and it's one person absorbing it. It's a very sort of personal, intimate thing, isn't it? A one-to-one kind of thing, and I think that's the power of it. And I really felt that was what really reached out to me in that work, was that it came really with that depth that despair gives. I think that's an interesting phrase, the depth of despair, because there is a lot of depth in it. I mean, I'm a melancholic by disposition, and I really feel that in myself, that wallowing in that despair for a while, on the other side of that, there really comes a certain type of richness and presence, and particularly when we have the opportunity for something like this, because this is a ritual that we're having now. It's the ritual of deep conversation. It's the ritual of a community gathering. It's a ritual of opening ourselves up to the unknown, because we don't know what the interaction of us here, you, me, and this place, and the agency of all of that, this particular moment, these particular mountains surrounding here, how they can lend their wisdom and lend their gravitas, if you like, because I think that's what I know, that this is what I recognised in this. It was sort of saying we need to find ways to more routinely be raw and real with each other in order to help us with the courage that these challenges require of us. Because they really do require us to be courageous in a certain way. And that courage is, I think, very difficult alone. Whereas in a space like this, I feel so much more capable, I suppose. And so there's something about the fact that you publish this, is that knowing other people are reading it, there's that sense of, there's a few of us out there gaining courage together. We don't know each other. So there's something about that sort of, that act.
It was one of the surprising things was how it was actually received, and how I had a few people who wrote and kind of said, thank goodness you said that. I mean, it's not that I'm the only one saying it. There's others who have. I guess I've done it in my way, but and I wondered at why the relief, why the oh, thank God you've said that, because I've been thinking about it, and I had a brief conversation with Hannah earlier, just before we began, and just about that topic, and how it's difficult for maybe in our culture to acknowledge anything that causes the deep grief and despair, and that's an idiosyncrasy that I think that we've adapted into in kind of a dysfunctional way over for whatever other reason, but that we do shy away from that. But it seems, I mean, I think you're right. I think it seems to me that unless we're willing to look at it squarely, and I think that's really evidence. It's evidenced that reaction also in a lot of the reactions that come out of mainstream media and the proponents, including on the green side of politics, to sort of slap down that kind of commentary and say this. It's almost paternalistic, because it says you can't do that to people. You've got to give people hope. What if you cause them to despair, and they never get out of it?
That's right.
then they won't do anything. And I feel like that is it feels like a naive interpretation of despair. It's a shallow interpretation of grief and despair, which does not view it as a fundamental human emotion which is inviting us to be contended with. And that it doesn't end there.
That's right.
And that's the point of the writing.
Emotion is an energy in motion. It's often interpreted as, and that it's meant to teach you something. It's meant to bring you to a new stance. It's the body seeking healing. That's what despair is. The body is calling out for transformation. It's calling out for this experience to be processed. My favourite writer, and I talk about him often, Martin Prechtel, he's from the shamanic tradition of Guatemalan Mayan culture, and his main thing is that our culture is swallowed in unconscious grief and shame, and because of that we are deeply unaware of our own power, because we never access our fullness, because our fullness comes from the processing of those depths, and that it's absolutely and completely necessary for us to process the hard emotions, and also absolutely necessary for us to do it collectively. But that's something that our culture has a particular difficulty with. There's so little wailing at funerals in this country, and so few deep grief rituals.
And it doesn't go away, does it? It's not like the absence of ritual means that people no longer have to contend with it. It just I was reading a text just recently on I stumbled across, which was he was a Jungian analyst, and he wrote about the midlife path, or it's essentially about a midlife crisis.
Sounds like James Hillman.
Yes, it was James Hillman, and it piqued my interest because I've just turned 40. So better I school myself. And the interesting commentary was around how the midlife crisis, as we understand it, is a phenomenon, but it doesn't occur in every culture, and it's in part because our culture doesn't have a way of initiating the adolescent into adulthood, and so what we contend with in the entry into midlife is that unprocessed emotion.
Exactly.
And so it bubbles up in all sorts of interesting dysfunctional ways instead.
That's right. I mean, Martin Prechtel again writes of this, that so much of our problem is not having an initiatory culture that schools you in. Initiation is actually an initiation into the despair of the world as well as great love of the world, and those two things together. You need those two together to hold each other. If it's just love of the world, you become a uncontrollable ecstatic perhaps, and if it's just fear or despair, it's not a full picture. And so, yes, when midlife comes around, it's the soul finally saying, look, we need to grow up. We really, really, really need to grow up. And, there's been plenty of sort of cultural commentary saying that, in the fringe, of course, saying that this whole crisis is about seeking to initiate us into more complexity and more depth. I find that useful, but one thing that has really, I think, I recently went to the Climate Emergency Summit, Sandy was there too, and that was a really interesting experience for me to try and hold the various things that came out of there, because one sort of the strongest, most sort of positive, and I don't mean that in a sense of good, but as in I don't know, a certain type of simplicity that said, yes, we can solve all our problems and grow our economy too. All we need to do is sort of shift to green energy and so forth. In other words, really not taking on board the full complexity and trying to stay with a simple solution and trying to get a solution that, yes, might buy us a little bit more time, but doesn't actually address the complexity of the depth of the change. It doesn't address the depth of the change that is really being called for. And so there was that, and then there was also the forum that I went to on First Nations response to climate change. And that was like, climate justice is the most important thing, and, we can't, Indigenous societies have been in a collapsed state for, since colonisation. They saw their world and culture completely shattered. They've been through collapse scenarios. That has to be recognised and that has to be rectified, and we've got to do due process, and we've got to do it now. And those two visions were completely irreconcilable. Like, completely. Because one was saying, stop mining coal, but, we can mine zinc and all these other things that we need to mine to make, all the new technologies. And yeah, right. Where's all of these big solar panel farms going? Where are all of these big wind farms going? Every single one of them's going on unceded Aboriginal land, aren't they? Every single one. It was really painful to sort of experience that sense that we've got to address the fossil fuel economy, and we've got to address it now. And we've got to start putting ourselves in right relation to our colonial history, and we've got to do that now. There was no...
And there's a tension there on one side that is asking us to speed up, and on the flip side asking us to slow down.
Absolutely.
Because to be able to contend with reconciliation, the slowing down is essential to the other process. And there was you reminded me of something that I think it was Iowa Kumalafe had said.
Yes.
And he says, and I love the wisdom in it. It's simple, but he said the times are urgent, and so let us slow down. And I think that's, for me anyway, that my interpretation of it is that to become more aware of the full complexity that we need to be attuned to be able to contend with the root cause of these crises, which is not as simple as just energy source. It's a little richer than that. Then it requires an attention which we've not been able to bring just yet. Certainly not on the scale that we need to. So that, I'm curious to know how it played out at the conference.
Well, it didn't. It didn't play out at the conference. So that was my curiosity, and that's why I put a post on Facebook, and I had something like 60 comments. There were a lot of people who were there who also felt that tension, and a lot of people in our culture who feel that tension as well. Immense urgency, and yet intense need to come into more complex relationships, and more subtlety and more depth with how things actually are. It seems, but Bayo Okomolafe, he's been quite an inspiration for me too. He's a Nigerian man who lives in India. He's doing some really interesting work in this, working with sort of some indigenous wisdoms from within his sort of complex networks that he's building. And yes, I mean, his one of his main points is the earth is alive and has agency, and that changes everything. So the way that we're operating in this is that we're the only ones who have agency, and we have done this. We have to get ourselves out of it. And I'm not saying that that's not true in any way, but I'm also interested in other truths as well and at the same time. And to me, and my brain at the moment, and my level of development and complexity, it's just trying to hold them without struggling for answers. In that famous, was that John Keats said, staying in the negative capability, holding two impossible things before breakfast, and then seeing if you can create a nice brunch out of them eventually, though it might not be until 11 o'clock that night, or a few years down the track. What I'm trying to say is that we can't answer these things, but it's really important, I think, to hold them all at once and to be okay without having the answers. Because when I was at the conference, I really noticed how seduced I was by answers. If everyone does this right now, we can change everything and we can solve all these problems. And you're there in the conference and everyone applauds, and then you leave the building. And then you're back out in the city streets and you go, oh, that's not going to happen, is it? It takes all of 3 seconds to realise, oh, I was in a little trance bubble here of hope. This complicated thing called hope.
One of the things I've been noticing in my work at the moment.
Can you say a little bit about your work? Yeah.
So my day job, I work in the water sector as a strategist, or a strategic planner, which is actually a bit of a misnomer in that I'm doing much more facilitation these days out of a realisation that I certainly don't have the answers for them. So the strategizing, I actually kind of outsource to the crowd, the community of experts in there. So I'm finding I'm doing a lot more facilitation of strategy development, which might sound a little beige, but it can be really interesting at times, because one of the things I've noticed is that in the water sector, it's predominantly engineers, and so that's a lot of the expertise that I'm drawing on. And there is a tendency, I guess, that might be part and parcel with the profession to an extent of really, really highly solution oriented. It's super practical, which is you absolutely need it when you're providing an essential service that public health kind of hinges on to an extent. So that's great, but the issue is that when they're trying to contend with problems that are clearly in the complex domain, that are not just a complicated machine, yet we're still trying to find the levers, to use a mechanistic metaphor, and then that is usually the terminology that is used to be able to, if we just pull this one thing, then we can change organizational culture, we can change the ecology around our infrastructure, we can, so these almost, it's a preoccupation and a possession by a metaphor which just does not belong in some environments, and that's the metaphor of the machine. And I think that that drives you to that orients you toward the question of what then shall I do? What is the thing that I will intervene with in order to change the world? And it's rarely ever how about we just sit here for a while and try to absorb the full complexity of this moment, or the challenge that we're contending with. And I'm noticing that in the processes that I'm dealing with is that like I'm now a certified warm data lab host. So for anyone who's familiar with warm data, it's the idea is born out of complexity theory and systems theory, and it's really trying to create a group process by which people can explore truly complex issues in real time, in communion with each other, through really organic conversation. And done well, it surfaces just some incredible things, right? And so I've run this a couple of times now with groups of engineers, and been mixed in with some other people too. And inevitably there's a split at the end of the conversation, and there are some people who I will ask, what was your experience here? And they say, wow, I thought I understood this issue, and then I realised throughout it that there was just these connections that were reifying and sort of jumping out, as neurons were popping, and people having these realizations, and then they come out of it with a sense of what they'd call like a humility. It's like, I feel like I actually don't understand this, and I need more time to just be with it, explore. And then the flip side is I will get the question, so when are we going to capture that? Should I have taken notes? What do we do with it? What do we do? And that impulse is so interesting to me, because what it's asking for really is, okay, so yeah, that was, I usually ask them, what was your experience? And they say, really interesting. And I made all these connections, and okay. And then they'll say, what do I do with that now? How do I capture it and then take it back to work so I've got something to show for it? And that impulse, I find, is one that says, we've explored all this complexity and we loved it and we saw it. We really saw it. Now, how do I bottle it? And how do I shoehorn it into my machine to be able to get it to do what I want it to do?
Yes.
And I'm still at a bit of a loss as to what to do, as to how to respond to that, because it is you talked earlier about the other different paradigms that were existing in that conference, and I really do think that this is and how it's deeper. They're not contending with the deeper issues, and really it is down at that level of perception and of paradigm.
Yes.
And that's a really hard thing to be able to draw people's attention to, because if they are so immersed in and wedded to the paradigm, it's like trying to ask them to look at their own eye, or to bite their own teeth. It's like, it's almost an impossible thing. So one of the areas that I'm really curious about, like right now, is how do you just open up? Like, are there ways that we can be in the world so as to spot the other cognitive openings across our communities, to be able to introduce that conversation,
yes,
and to let that unfold. And that's because I don't know that I've sort of deeply I fear getting a result out of these kinds of conferences, and the momentum that's gathered under under climate change activism, I kind of fear getting a renewable economy which sustains us for another 50 years, and which gives us the permission to continue on with the same paradigm that created the problem. Do you know what I mean? It's
Totally.
like a tension here that I...
Yes, exactly. It's just deferring the inevitable, which is the sort of the greed of the extractive model and the damage created by the machine metaphor in some ways. I mean, it's not just that. I don't want to try and reduce it to just that. I mean, what came up for me when you were speaking is I'm very passionately interested in, and it's something that I work on with Kat here, because we've been facilitating dance events in Warburton for the last 7.5 years and so forth. And a big part of why we're doing that is that we have both come to an awareness of the importance of embodiment in landing, creating a container for more complex information to be held. So the levels of sort of grief, despair, complexity, frustration, confusion that these times create in us need a really strong body to hold them. And they need a limber body, they need a flexible body, they need a body that knows how to breathe and knows how to touch and knows how to be held. And I feel very convinced of that because of... Convinced is not a word I like. I feel very smitten by that idea because I think of how nourishing it's been for me to be able to work through emotions through the body. And the big thing about that is that sense of staying with the unknown and the mystery of the body. So something that I use a lot in my work is, of the million bits of information, every million bits of information that come to the human body from the world, the estimate is that 14 of those million bits are processed by the cognitive mind, which means 999,986 bits go to the body and are not taken in. In other words, most of what's going on, our body registers and our mind has no idea. What is the reality that we're really contending with is another way of saying it. And it's saying that the cognitive capacity is severely limited. But that the body knows way more than the brain gets. And you can feel that when you have a good cry and you have a sense of, oh, I needed that to understand something or to move something. And that sense of, oh, my body knew I needed that. But I, cognitive mind, didn't quite get that. So I'm very interested in a language that stays with mystery and complexity and not knowing and life systems. So the system of ecology that my body is and its mysterious knowledge, and what we might be able to do as a culture if we all go, okay, this is what we know cognitively. What does our body feel about that? What can our body show us about that? And finding new ways of communicating or learning, co-learning, ritualizing the knowledge that our body has, that our cognitive mind hasn't arrived at. And the thing is, because it's actually pretty obvious, because the body loves joy and comfort and touch and kindness and children and flowers and all good things. I mean, it's like a cliche, it's like childhood things or romantic things, because we've tried to put these things away because they don't work well with the machine metaphor. They don't work well with a model that is trying to cut up the world to use. But if we could let back what our body loves, then I think we'd have a much sort of surer sense of what life wants, if that makes sense. And I can say all that while also trying to sit with the knowledge that, my God, do we somehow need giant technological solutions to get us out of this carbon mess? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like all of that, but then this immense problem.
Hanging with the uncertainty is a real challenge. That's deeply disquieting for most, and that was the experience I was explaining just before. Is that impulse to say what do we do is coming from that place of being deeply uncomfortable with not knowing, and not being able to resolve and close off and act. And I wonder though, just to add a glimmer of hope here, is that what I feel like I'm seeing is that the converging crises that kind of I mentioned earlier are presenting in such visceral forms now that I feel like it's opening the space for that conversation. And I feel like there's more receptivity to other ways of knowing, or even suggestions of other ways of knowing, and I don't want to put engineers all in that basket, because one came to me after the second warm data lab that he did, and he said, after the first one I was deeply skeptical and I didn't really get what you were talking about, and after the first one that's how I felt, and after the second one that I've just done, it just kind of dropped. I got it. I got what you mean. I knew then that the only way I'm not going to be able to explain it to somebody else, and so I was like, here's a guy. I didn't expect that from this guy. But it was that the issue that we were trying to grapple with was of great complexity and significance, that I think you almost have to be so bold as to kind of say, look, are you taking this at all seriously? Because if you are, why would you insist that I continue to apply the same kinds of thinking that we've always applied to this situation, and full well, probably underpinning at least part of the reason why we're in the mess. So if you're serious about it, let's expand the ways of knowing to include maybe actually holding complexity for a little while longer before you try to act on it. And so I'm kind of hopeful that if there's anything good to come of the recent bushfires and coronavirus and various other things that are converging, it might be that you're getting a greater portion of the population who could be open to other ways of knowing, including myself. I mean, as I've explained to you previously, Mayo, I'm probably have learned myself into this culture being super left-brained, and in recent years have realised that it's just not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see that too, that there's an enormous potential in this time because of the paradoxical level of complexity that we're facing. It's like, this can't be solved. Right. Sitting with the unsolvable for long enough to see what the body might say, it's an interesting process if you can be held through the anxiety of it. And I think that's what interests me about what you're doing, and, you know, it inspires me to do what I'm trying to do, is how do we model that degree of respect for uncertainty, if that makes sense, to really honour uncertainty and complexity, and not just we have to, but it has more knowledge than we do. How do we rise to the complexity of the time? How do we allow ourselves to be changed?
And perhaps rituals like this.
Exactly.
Question.
Yeah.
No, I it's quite interesting what you're talking about, but to me, I get this anxiety about what's happening to the planet and whatever, and I think we should be doing something. You know, I agree with the complexity, but there's some no-brainer things that, you know, the world could do to just get the ball
Exactly.
rolling.
Exactly.
You know,
And that's exactly what I was trying to express, of coming out of that climate conference, of all, you know, a few thousand people going, it's a total no-brainer, it's so completely obvious, therefore, because it's so clear and because it's so needed, of course it will be done. And then you read the papers.
Yeah.
And then you understand the political intransigence, and you go, just because it's logical, sensible, utterly essential, and desperately timely doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. So how to sit with that frustration and that paradox, and to try and find these other resources of complexity and subtlety and nuance, and not to say that that's necessarily the right thing, but, you know, this to me was my real experience of coming out and getting excited by the positivity and going, okay, yes, there's still time, we can be saved, and getting swept up in that sort of messianic image, and then going, Maya, you've been here before, many, many times over the last 3 decades. There was an article, I think, was it some famous American writer wrote in the New Yorker last November or something. There was
Jonathan Franzen.
I think it was that one, where he was basically saying a very similar point of, how do we sit with the fact that, yes, if everything could line up and everyone was completely emotionally and psychologically mature enough to say yes to difficulty and making things happen, but, you know, are we really at that point? And he had to say, well, no, we're not. Therefore, it's something else, and how to sit with that something else.
Yeah, and a call to complexity is not a call to navel gazing.
No.
It is it's a call to humility, I think, and it's a call to sit with it a little longer, and going back to that idea of Mr. Akumalafe with, you know, other times are urgent, let us slow down. It's a care that has to be brought to those kinds of challenges, and I feel like we have such a litany of unintended consequences that we've wrought, and it's all good intention, all of it. It's really, really good intention, and one of the ones that I just find so tragic, yet amusing at some level too, at our hubris, is one that I read about just recently, which was in India in the 1990s, early 1990s. There was a problem with bovine inflammation, and of course it's a large dairy-consuming country, but not beef. So a lot of cows, and this issue, this systemic issue with cows, and a drug company came up with a drug, which, you know, they deployed it. It solved the drug. It solved the other inflammation. And then they noticed that the 80 million strong population of vultures in the country began to decline really quickly. And so they investigated this to see what the cause was. And of course, in India, because they don't harvest the dairy cattle for beef, they kind of leave them for the vultures to dispose of. Efficient system. And they were eating meat with trace amounts of this drug, and they happened to have a really hypersensitivity. They had hypersensitivity in their kidneys to this, even just a trace amount of the substance. So as a result, the 80 million population declined over the course of just a few years to about 100,000. Now I think it's even less than that now, and it didn't end there. Right? So as soon as that happened, of course, there's a surplus of the meat, which is being just rotting away. So another predator comes in to be able to harvest that, and so the wild dog population soared, along with the wild dog population going up. So did the other number of casualties and human deaths from rabies. Along with that, because there was a high population of your other wild dogs in the urban areas, it became a hunting ground for leopards who were encroaching on the urban territory and coming into conflict with humans. And obviously, humans usually they're faring better in the long run. And it doesn't even end there. One of the most tragic consequences is there's a community in India which is the Zoroastrian community, who have a practice with their dead where they don't bury or cremate. They believe that for the soul to ascend to heaven, the body has to be devoured, and so they put it in what they call a temple of silence, and it's usually devoured by carnivores, usually vultures, because they're the only ones that can get in. And of course, with the rapid decline, the bodies were taking up to 6 months to disappear, which became a public health issue. So as the government clamped down and said you can't have that practice anymore. So a cultural practice which had lasted 2,500 years was gone as a result of the introduction of one thing which ostensibly solved the problem.
Of an illness in cows.
Of an illness in cows. And it's just like, and there's like, as I've gotten into unintended consequences, there's like, our history is just so riddled with it. It's ridiculous that we haven't learnt this yet. And I know that you cannot predict every consequence all the time, but it's almost irreconcilable in some ways in our culture to find a way to act in a way that satisfies us and the speed at which we want to operate, and still avoid those kinds of catastrophes. And I feel like things like permaculture are a great example of how that is being navigated, in terms of the care that is taken in watching and learning and understanding what the system already wants to do, and then working with that. And that kind of care, though, is so hard to bring into a space where it's action.
That's right.
Let's get the show on the road. We haven't got time.
Yeah, and the anxiety that comes with that, with urgency.
And I get it. Like, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. But but for me, the not solving the problem is as terrifying as potentially solving it by pumping a whole lot of like radiation, like shielding materials into the atmosphere. Like this to me seems a dreadful mistake if we ever went there.
Well, that's right. If anyone who's watched The Matrix would know, that's what they did.
Right. There you go.
Did you? Yeah. Backstory of The Matrix. Don't go there. Yes. I'm not sure what the time is. Have you got the 8:15? 8:15. I'm wondering whether it would be time for questions.
So yeah, I mean, I did read your article, I guess it was probably a month ago or something, and really enjoyed it. But I found there was sort of hope in it as well around, community and localisation, I guess, of our economies and things like that. But I guess I'm interested to know on what your reflections are now. How long ago was that you?
May last year.
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, putting into action some of those ideas that you put forward, and maybe for some of the people who maybe not everyone's read the article, it might be good to hear.
So for me, I think I watched the other conversation of Meg and Patrick that occurred in the last time or last year, which I don't know when that occurred.
It was August.
Exactly, but I watched it just recently, and for me, I kind of felt like a bit of an imposter coming here after them, because for me it's like they're doing the work. They're really doing the work, and for me, I've come slow to this, I think. So I was telling Maya earlier that my progress has been in some ways shameful in practical terms. In other ways, we are making incremental progress. So some of the things that I kind of outlined in the essay were things like the necessity of finding ways to build coherence with community. So, and what I meant by that in there was in a culture where we know that trust is kind of at record lows and dropping, trust in institutions and in media and in our neighbours, I think that it's imperative that we find new ways to converge and to bring all the complexity and diversity, and to be able to commune in ways which actually are able to account for complexity, while also having things on the agenda that we can do together. And so that's a space that crosses over to a degree into my work life. So I'm able to spend a lot of time on that. So I think that while it doesn't feel to me to be super practical, I think learning how to maybe guide people through complexity, and to be able to facilitate a degree of comfort as they move into that is something that I'm really working on, and that I think I'm making some headway in. And I guess one of the areas that I'm really interested in is that notion of if you trace all these things upstream, you find it's a problem of perception. Then how do we introduce the processes which allow people to come together to be able to find those different ways of knowing, which will allow for a different perception to take hold. So that's a real sort of focus area that is more sort of abstract, and probably at the level that I operate most of the time in terms of that left the brain just dominating. But on a more practical level, though, my wife is probably way more practical than I am in this sense. And so she's a baker, she's a micro baker, and she began that a couple of years ago. And ever since we've been having these conversations around these kinds of themes, one of the things that I think or the conclusions that we've drawn is that, and they're not just we've drawn, actually, there's good academic data behind this, that a social capital, trust, having connection and knowing people is, if you want a security blanket moving into an uncertain future, and you know this, you've set up a community here, you know, like, that's it. I don't think much else is going to do it. And so as a micro baker, which is not really an economically viable business, like, it doesn't make a lot of money, but it has enabled so many new connections in the community, and for us and our family to become a part of an area a community where we've been not particularly integrated into previously. So that, I think that's been a really important development for our family. Yeah, does that answer your question? I'm trying to think of other things coming to mind, but I'm on the spot.
Yeah, and just to reflect back to you, I think that as much as Megan Patrick's talk was incredibly inspiring, I think for probably the majority of, and particularly kind of mainstream Australia, it's intimidating and inaccessible to jump, take that grand leap, sort of so far ahead, which is where they are. Which is, I think it's wonderful what they're doing.
So that's really interesting. Okay, yeah, that's a question that I've sort of grappled with, because I look at the way that they're living, and yes, it's inspirational in the same way that the more that I learn about, say, the Amish community, and how they prioritise, they identify their clear values, highest value, family, and in their case, faith, and then everything else will serve that. And if it doesn't, like certain kinds of technology, then they're like, oh, it's going to fragment the family, it's gone. That's a massive leap for most people. But what was I going to say? The incremental change that is enabled by things like my wife's bread business, and where I'm now contemplating, like, I'm on 5 days a week at the moment, full-time work, but it's my daughter's just turned 4 years old, and she'll be in school if we send her the next year. So I've got a year basically where she's still at home most of the time, and I'm thinking, right, I want to go down to four or 3 days per week just to be able to devote that, because that's where, I mean, for me it seems it seems so intuitive and so basic that is where the investment, or an awful term to use, but should be made. But I think that there are ways to incrementally do that, but it's a battle, because when I was talking to, I think, Trav earlier about this, it's like you're in this basin of attraction where you're kind of oscillating within that, and every time you try and move out of it or onto the lip of the next one, it just sort of pulls you back in through, expectations on what kind of education you're going to give your children, or sort of lifestyle you're going to live. So it is a massive leap. I've had this conversation with my wife a number of times now, that it seems like you can't actually make that shift until such time as you coalesce with others who are going to do the same. Because to be able to finance a household, the practicalities of it are that unless you're going to go super frugal, on everything, and even that's hard living, then how do you disperse the expenses? Just the practicality of that. It seems to me that either you jack up your income, in which case you're compromising on a whole lot of other values and time, or you begin to move into community. You begin to find different ways of living. So it's an area that I'm in deep exploration and conversation around at the moment. What other ways? So you guys are an inspiration in that regard for me, and I'm sure it's got its ups and downs as well. But that you're able to pave the way, and others can learn from you. But I would love to get your thoughts on that, if that is a viable way for those who are in the mainstream.
I've just been reflecting as well a lot about just privilege, because obviously it's a privilege to eat organic food that we grow ourselves. Of course, there's a lot of work in that, but a lot of people don't have access to the privilege that we have. Like in this community, we have so much, access to fresh, beautiful water, beautiful, land for growing food. Not just our land here, but there's lots of community land that's, community gardens and things like that around that, you can do these things. The opportunities are there, but I feel like many communities, don't have such privilege that we have in the Yarra Valley. So in some ways it is easier for us to be doing these kinds of making changes, and a lot of people just don't have that opportunity.
And maybe we need to be the example that we can be, and forge connections with people who are land poor or time poor, and create those examples.
Yeah, but I did really also love talking to Laura before about how, with her harvest, she's time poor, she doesn't have the time to preserve or to do anything with the harvest, and therefore she finds people that can do that for her and then give her back some of the preserves. So that exchange, the exchanges that you make within your communities, I think they're fantastic ways, where you can create a win-win situation from the resources that you all have access to, whether it be time, whether it be fruit, or whether it be land or
absolutely
skills, or creating these connections where we can all actually help each other to create win-win situations for everyone.
I think there's an importance in looking into where our connections lie. So generally we're quite fragmented. So for an example, like in a standard possible community, where you take something to be fixed and you pay someone to fix it, we generally don't have too much conversation around that. I'm really blessed to live in a place that requires little income to live there, but it requires lots of time sharing and giving, and that's just a simple community, but it's who I choose to hang out with. So rather than pay for a lot of things, which is, like people live in, especially in the Yarra Valley, on, sharing rather than paying for stuff, but making those changes where possible. And it might mean that you have to be the one that steps up first and does a bit more of the giving in the first part, just to initiate that connection. But my kind of goal in life at the moment is to use whatever the interaction that I need, whether that's to fix my horse trough or cut firewood or to do whatever, that ideally that's in developing a relationship. And I work for money, I do people's properties and gardens, but my most important factor when I go to that garden is not just actually to work on the land, but it's to have a connection to that person that lives on that property, so they also have a connection to the land, but they have a connection to me. So part of my job, I actually look at it, I drink tea a lot, which is like the bonus part. But I think that's a really important factor, and I don't have time to do everything myself, but if I can go to the lady next door who doesn't have the physical capability to harvest, and I can take a box of figs, for example, and she brings me back half a thing of jam. I can't eat half of the jam that she gives me back, but then I can exchange that jam over here with someone for zucchinis, or someone over there, or the guy that comes and cuts my wood. thank God he's here. You know, that kind of stuff, and that's a pretty big key, I think, in
And
the small community world.
I love that. And in terms of the positive unintended consequences of that, I was having a conversation just lately with a guy from Northeastern University in Boston, and he's a social scientist who looks at social capital and what that does. So trust and social connections, and what that does in the instance of disaster. And what's really interesting is that those informal connections that you're making there, as that played out in, I think it was 2011 in Japan with the tsunami, the greatest predictor. So if you to take a single indicator and say, like, you know, is a person actually going to survive the disaster and then thrive afterwards? The greatest predictor was nothing to do with how much money they had, or how many connections to power they had, or anything like that, or infrastructure. It was whether or not they trusted their neighbour, and how well their other neighbours knew each other. It's just those really, really simple connections, because how that translated in practice was, oh, we know that Mrs. So-and-so next door has some mobility issues. Or I know there's a tsunami coming, I'm going to go and knock on the door, because I've had many cups of tea with her and I know the ins and outs of her life. And so that's why we don't mind at all doing the bread business, even though it doesn't bring in a lot of cash, because it's just like, this is adding such a richness, and it's just enjoyable. I mean, that's the utility that I've just pointed out, but it's what you live for. So yeah.
I think one of the key things people do in community is create events that bring people together. So we have a lady that's what she does for our community. So she brings, you know, community dinners together, or repair workshops, or, you know, morning teas, or whatever. And, you know, they're accessible to everyone through different fundings, and a lot she funds herself. But those people that can do that, so I'm a much more individual human. I'm really good at just doing small groups and stuff. And I do one facilitation a year for that group. But for those, like, you know, for you who bring these kind of groups together, or the Peace Fund provides space, or, you know, where we can facilitate that on a community setting, or at least for me, what I can do is support the person who does that.
Yeah.
Yes. Other questions or comments? Or
I'm curious to know where you came across the warm data lab stuff, and it comes from Bateson's work. And what, I don't know too much about it, but I'm curious to know where you came across it, and I don't know, you don't have to go into too much depth, but how it works.
Just trying to think how I came across it. Well, I've been interested in complexity theory and systems theory for quite a few years, and stumbled across it somewhere there.
might have even been in conversation with me.
It could have been,
because Nora Bateson, so she's the daughter of Gregory Bateson, who's the famous ecologist. She came to Melbourne last year, and she and I did an event together, and she made some connections in Melbourne, and then you asked her whether she would come back to Melbourne to run a warm data lab.
So I started getting interested in the idea, and that's how it usually begins for me. And then I found out that she was coming to Australia. She was, but they were trying to tentatively take up one in Melbourne, and then I kind of put my hand up to help organise that. So I ended up helping to organise that just up the road in Warby. And the approach, though, you asked about the approach.
Yeah, I haven't been a part of that. I've seen that facilitated, and would be curious.
Yeah, sure. Well, we've got some labs coming up in the West Gippsland area pretty soon, I think. But I'm sure that Santha is also a host in this area, so might be some opportunities. I'll jump on board. So the idea is, I guess, maybe the easiest way to explain it is warm data is contrasted with cold data is the way that Nora kind of explains it anyway. So cold data is the reductionist, isolating, your key data points, you're pulling
facts
pulling
and stats
pulling your facts out of your observations of a complex system out of their context and going, yeah, I know what that is, and then putting sort of back in, but obviously that doesn't do much justice to how the thing operates as a complex adaptive system. So the idea of warm data is trying to do that sort of exploration of the complex system while it's still living and moving, and so it's really drawing on ways of knowing and human knowledge rather than say modelling, where you are through a process of conversation, which is really fluid, and the structure of the lab kind of it looks simple, but it enables a degree of fluidity and for you to be able to hop through different contexts while exploring the one topic. Which what ends up happening is you begin to notice kind of in your peripheral vision, like metaphorically speaking, these connections that are being formed as you hop through the different contexts and realise where the interdependencies are. To a degree, that process is kind of unconscious, I think. So this is where you're beginning to play with. I think the process. This is maybe not how Nora articulates it, but the process appears to widen perception. So I think in some ways it sort of primes your perception to be able to just widen it a little bit, to be able to see things that maybe you wouldn't be able to see once you move out of the process. I think what is really powerful about the process is that for most people coming out of our culture, it would be like a pretty embodied knowing. Not necessarily for you, mate, because you're next level sort of in that domain, but for most people, I think that's the experience that it gives. So you come out with I think probably a third lab that I did, I came out with for a pretty heady sort of a person. This was an unusual experience where I came out actually pretty emotional and feeling like there was something I knew here. It wasn't here anymore. It was actually more deep-seated than that. And it caused a fundamental adjustment in my disposition toward things like my family or toward things like my community. And the difficulty with it, and this is where people get to the end of it, and some people are like, so what do I do with it? Is that it's like, if it's in here, that's actually all you need to do with it. Because if you just widen your perception and you've got a deeper sense of knowing, then as you move through the world with that, you'll start to make decisions.
And see things, lots of other things different.
Maybe in different ways, yeah. So.
It
I don't, do you want to?
I just had a major realisation as you were talking. Just yes, everything that you're saying is how I perceived it. But something that you said just then, and I kind of went, it's actually it's a creative process. So if you're an artist or you're somebody that's working as a performer or an actor or something, it's the thing you train in to tap into your intuition and to be connected, embodied. I know my background is acting, and I spent years trying to find, the impulse. And you sit with that, and you sit with the complexity to try and find the truth in something. And so that process is very familiar to me. And so, because I really struggled, because it was really academic. It was like, presenting theory after theory after theory, and it was just like, I just was bamboozled.
That's the host training, not the lab itself.
No, yeah, sorry, the training. So just as you were saying that, and then referring to Maya and saying, well, you're already embodied. So I didn't have lots of light bulb moments because that's the way I operate in the world. And so I was trying to make sense of it through the academic. I was trying to go, okay, I don't get that. So that's the thing, I'm trying to get to it, and yet the work itself makes perfect sense. because what you're doing is you're creating an authentic moment between people that's not too scary. I'm not asking you to stand in the middle of the space and go like that and kind of embody a tree or something. So it's an accessible way of addressing a particular part of community, which is probably the largest percentage, and creating a safe space for them to start to explore and drop into that. So I don't know if I just went sideways.
Yeah.
I think that's a really powerful point. It's around that safe space for people who've been trained in, and we all have. We've all been, even if we're artists and so forth, we might have a harder time fitting in, but we have the mechanistic model going on all the time in pretty much everything. It's the unconscious background to everything. And because of so much of our world is made, and then made by machines, it's this underlying background. So this sort of warm data lab, it's sort of, because of its sort of randomness and lack of rules and sort of fluidity, it's sort of a training back into the body.
It's funny though, because it's not it's not, it's very prescriptive in terms of the way you present it, but once you're inside it, like the conversations can just disappear off to the corners of the room and come back again. But there's something about the framing of it that holds it really intensely. So yeah, so is that tension, that paradox that between being inside something that's very held, but actually that giving you the freedom to head off.
That's right. And you don't have to woo-woo and pretend you're a tree. You don't have to emote. You don't have to do these other things. It's a different way in to a different kind of perception that lands in the body. And as you said, that's what you need. You're going away with a different body, which sort of possibly came via a cognitive process, and different people will need different ways in to developing and holding complexity.
Yeah.
This is one way. This is a way that we as a group of people right now are seeking to enable complexity.
Yeah.
Even
just it offers up the other space for people to either engage or not engage, or just be present and listen, but not necessarily feel compelled like they have to say something, which is a lot of people go through it, and I'll say, you know what, I just stopped talking for a while and I listened, and you're swirling through the lab, hearing all these different angles on the same issue through different contexts, and I think it's not often that we actually get within a compressed time period so many different perspectives, and I don't know what it is about the lab, but it invites people to just tell personal stories. And it's not that you say that explicitly, they just do. So as a result, they can be in a work context and doing the same thing. And so that means that the salience in that, it's just, they're so, the other narratives coming out are so personal and visceral. It means that they land better. And so as a result, you have that happen in context after context after context. So in a compressed time period, it's like, when do you ever have a conversation like that? And so it's any wonder that now, like I was talking with Nora just a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying she's working with a community in the UK that's really talking about privilege, like completely not, like really having a hard time of it. And when she got in there, they were already at loggerheads with each other, and fighting, and But then when the lab began and they sort of began to work into that process, it fostered a sense of communion, and it became a kind of a ritual that now they're like, we need more of that, because whatever happened there got us into a dialogue which we don't a pattern of dialogue which we do not usually experience, and so for community building, that's why one of my projects, I guess, is to try and get that going in the West Gippsland area, because it's just such a even if you're not talking about complexity, nothing else, just the communing as a ritual on a regular basis, as a practice, like it could be extremely powerful. It's like, more of that, please.
James, when you were introducing that idea before, and you were saying about, that to understand complexity, let's just sit down together and not talk, I was really reminded of like the time I spent working in Arnhem Land, and you always knew that if there was a problem that was needed to be solved in the community, they'd just sit down under a tree and just sit there, maybe even all day, without even talking, just looking out onto the field or whatever, and spend so much time just in silence, really pondering this question or dilemma or complexity or whatever, and it feels like that's really a return to kind of an Indigenous way of being. And
Beautiful.
That really resonates. Thank you for bringing that back in, because that is you know what I'm secretly hoping for is a new renaissance of sorts. So the Renaissance in the 1400s to 1600s drew on what made it so special was that it went back to the other classical texts of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and it took that old knowledge and it fused it with what was going on in the context of Florence and northern Italy of that time, and created other foundations for new ways of perceiving the world. That's fundamentally what led to the Enlightenment and what gave us the modern age, for all of its good and its bad. I'm secretly hoping for a new kind of Renaissance where we can go further back than that, where we can actually begin to understand, because it's like you can't co-opt this these practices, but there's something that they have to teach us. So what is that? And how does that, we can't go back to it, but how does that fuse with what we've got now, with what we know now, the best of that? So that's the, I don't know where that goes, but it was just an idea that I wanted to throw in the mix.
It's so close to the sort of things that we've been talking about, and also my work around deep listening, inspired by Dardiri, Miriam Rose Ngama's work, Daly River region, an incredible Indigenous educator, and the similarity of her work to Goethe, the German scientist who he was the person who Steiner spent the first 10 years of his academic life studying seriously Goethean science, and then went off and did everything that Steiner did, which was a lot. It was all about a science of life. So how do you actually be with an alive being, a plant, a field, an animal, in enough quietness, enough sensitivity, and enough compassion, enough open-heartedness to understand its life from the inside? So the was doing science without cutting it up, without killing it, but understanding it through really your body, letting your body teach you about the body of another being. And so that the science of that is very, very similar to Australian Indigenous science, which is, well, we do this because this plant told us. And they mean that literally. They mean they spent enough time listening, as Kat said, under the tree, just looking out, listening. What's the land going to teach us? And that's not a metaphor. That's a real sense of, if you be with life long enough, quietly enough, open-heartedly enough, and with enough dignity and respect for the aliveness of other beings, all sorts of things can be learned, which really is the basis of what permaculture is all about. What can we learn from listening? That is an indigenously, it's a local to this part of the world system that came from, David Holmgren, whose, awareness of the complexity of environmental problems in the early 70s, the sheer
because he's so brilliant and because he saw how many converging crises there were coming in the 70s. They knew that in the 70s, they knew about it all, climate change and so forth. That's very much the foundation of permaculture, was dealing with that level of complexity through who you become. And that is an interesting segue, because Dan Palmer, who is our next speaker in May, is going to be talking about just that. So you'll have to come back
I'll definitely come back
for that.
for sure.
I'm aware that we've been nattering for a long time and you've listened so deeply and beautifully. It's been absolutely gorgeous. I'm wondering if there are more questions. Maybe we could talk more casually over tea and so forth. How does that feel? Yeah, I'm seeing nods.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
James Allen, it's been brilliant to have you here. I absolutely loved it, and I knew it would be a wonderful thing to have you here with our community. So thank you so much for coming over the hills and joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the conversation. It was really, wonderful.